Okay, so we'll jump into it. Again, my name is John Grubb. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Bay Area Council. Um, what we have today is an early holiday gift. We have two of the sharpest, smartest, wittiest journalists California has ever produced with us today. A little bit more about the two that we have. So first of all, Marisa Lagos staffs California's Politics and Government Desk. KQED, of course, is the Bay Area's NPR station. It is the most listened to station in the Bay Area. And in fact, it is the most listened to public radio station in the entire United States. So Marisa presides over quite an empire. Prior to these lofty heights, she wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Examiner, and a little paper called I think it's pronounced Los Angeles Times. She's won lots of awards, in particular for her coverage of wildfires and criminal justice, but all kinds of other topics. So who's this John Myers guy? Well, who isn't John Myers? John Myers started as a TV reporter and a news anchor. Of course, you know, look at the fella. In 2003, he made his way to KQED. He's become one of the most sought after voices on California politics. In 2012, ABC News stole him from KQED and made him their political editor in Sacramento. And then the LA Times, that same newspaper, wooed him, and he served as the Sacramento bureau chief for the past 5 years. And he presides over the largest political reporting team and columnists in California, in Sacramento. In 2006, before they were a thing, John launched the California Politics podcast, which became the state's most popular political podcast, and a frequent co-host was none other than Marisa Lagos on it. So they've worked together generally pretty well. We'll find out how well they work together again today. I had the honor of traveling with John to China with Governor Brown. That was in 2013, I think it was. On a Bay Area Council trip, which was really fun and really exhausting. I haven't had the chance to go to China with Marisa, but we've still got a whole lifetime ahead of us, so we'll work on that. So anyway, thank you very, very much, both of you. We really appreciate the work that you do, what you make possible for your listeners and your readers. You've spoken with the Bay Area Council before, and so we're really honored, you know, your familiar voices to our audience. So let's dive into the questions, and the way we'll structure this is that I'll ask a few questions to start us off, and then please use the Q&A function in Zoom. You all know how to do this by now, I hope. And we'll sort of go through moderated questions from the audience a little bit later on. So I want to start with the state ballot measures. Voters statewide affirmed gig economy, job flexibility, and consumer privacy expansion, but rejected affirmative action. And at least in our point of view, we were very happy that they rejected increasing business property taxes. They left in place some criminal justice reform. Marisa, let's start with you. What's your read of the ballot measure results in California for the most recent election?
You know, I think that California voters are more nuanced in their beliefs than maybe the national media gives them credit for. I think in my experience covering this, voters seem to take their responsibility voting for initiatives pretty seriously. I think it's hard to draw kind of clean conclusions because a lot of these results are all over the map. I also think, you know, in the case of State Prop 15, the attempt to roll back the limits on commercial property taxes. I don't think that's the last we've heard of it. It was a very close outcome. It was not a rout by any means. And so I think that like that one, if we want to talk about that in particular, and a couple others I think are really indicative of like the kind of challenging moment we're in politically in the middle of a pandemic reduced in recession, induced recession. And I think, you know, that would have already been a challenging argument for labor to make because people are very protective of Prop 13 in California, but I think they were probably stymied in addition, not just by the very well-funded business opposition, but also just this question of like, is this the right time? I think Prop 22 is the gig economy one is a great example of how you can really buy your way into policy if you don't like what the legislature does. unprecedented spending, over 200 million. I don't think that's the last we'll hear about that. I think we'll see the companies try to take this to other states, and I think we'll see Labor and Democrats try to push back on that. I think with that one, it was maybe brilliantly crafted in the sense that it's very hard to know what the impacts are going to be on drivers, frankly. I know that, both sides have claims, but I think what people will actually be making and what it will mean for them is really up in the air. And so I think that's going to be kind of something to watch. And then, on some of the other ones, criminal justice, I think Prop 20 was a huge win for the establishment, who's really supported a lot of these changes over the past decade. It was a real rebuke of law enforcement, who has essentially tried to paint, Prop 47, Prop 57, realignment as really detrimental. I think voters kind of soundly rejected that. If we want to talk about bail, I could spend an hour on that. I think that one's a little more complicated. I don't really group that one in as much with Prop 20 because I think the left kind of cannibalized itself on that measure. And on something like affirmative action, I think this just shows that some of these issues remain really complicated, and that even in a moment of protest and sort of racial reckoning, that not policies that maybe the legislature saw as very directly related to that type of debate were not necessarily viewed that way by the electorate. And I think that, along with Prop 15, really speaks to how you have to think about not just the moment we're in, but the sort of historic importance of some of these policies, or at least the assumptions people make about them in California. And then, I think broadly, from stepping back just from the election in general, some of these congressional races, Republicans were able to flip, again, I don't buy the California's not progressive. I think we're still a pretty blue progressive state, but I also think it's a very diverse state. And I think that, in Orange County, that is a battleground now. And we're going to continue to see both parties have to really fight it out there. We can talk about those in more depth, but I do think that that's related to this bigger question of how did the electorate break in November? And I'll just say, on a really positive note, we did it. We had an election in a pandemic. It was actually smoother than the primary in many counties, especially LA. And so I think for all of the kind of national rhetoric around this election and the concerns around the pandemic and the real undermining of so many of our norms by the Trump campaign, I think we should be really happy right now that we pulled off something very complicated in California, and really, John might have a different view, but I think fewer problems than I've seen in many past elections that were not nearly this difficult to execute.
That's great. So, John, I'll let you comment on the ballot measures if you want to, but I was going to tee up another question to you, which is, on the national level. So there was a seismic shift with the election of Joe Biden, and this changes the world of the possible for a lot of California policies and priorities. So what do you see in the tea leaves of Joe Biden's election? And obviously there's some prominent Californians who are joining the administration. How do you see his election and Kamala Harris's election impacting California going forward?
Well, a couple thoughts. And first of all, good morning to all 120 people it looks like who are on here. I wish you had something else that you had to spend your morning with, but you're stuck with me and Marisa. You're stuck with me. Marisa, you could be thrilled to have. So I want to link the two things together briefly, because what I was going to say on the other one somewhat applies to this. The national politics really sucked all the political oxygen out of the room, I think, in a lot of ways for this California election. We're going to see final voter participation numbers this week. We're going to break a record for participation of the eligible electorate that goes back to 1940. It's amazing. And yet the ballot measure story, which we can talk about some of them in detail later, to me, some of the results are a reflection to me of we were in a pandemic where people they did not have a lot of time to focus on anything other than the election in front of them, which was the presidential race. And so I think the presidential race sucked a lot of oxygen out of those races. And as a result, to Marisa's point, I don't know that you can read any firm path in the tea leaves because I would argue a lot of different things were at play and how those ballot measures worked. And also, side note, I think the real lesson of ballot measures is that campaigns matter. And when a campaign is run well, and some of those that she talked about, money and messaging, things happen. So looking forward to obviously the fact that the presidential race is over in the mind of everybody but the president. What does California get out of this? I mean, obviously the clout, we all know that. We have a vice president-elect. We're going to have cabinet members from California. I'm still trying to figure out where I think the crossover lines on policy. I mean, the most obvious one to me is the two most obvious ones to me are immigration and environmental issues. And the thing that I look at the most is look how many times the state of California sued the Trump administration. We are over the 100 mark there, scores of things. And I should have thrown in healthcare. 3 things we sued a lot about. We sued a lot about healthcare, environment, and immigration. And I think all 3 of those, the absence of the fight is going to be interesting. Now, whether that turns into like an actual larger role for California or California leading the country, I'm not sure. I think environmental issues certainly, if for no other reason than look at the car manufacturers who have all walked back from being on the Trump administration side to all of a sudden saying, you know, I think we really are lined up with California on those emissions issues. So I think environmental issues are big. We may see Mary Nichols, the outgoing chair of the State Air Resources Board, as a leading candidate for EPA administrator. Environment's big. Immigration, we're going to be simpatico, I think, with the Biden administration. Certainly a ratcheting down of the rhetoric and the concern about the way that we deal with immigration issues. And then after that, and then healthcare, because of course, no state has embraced the Affordable Care Act more than California. No state was faster to expand its Medicaid program, our Medi-Cal program, and certainly covered California. And I think the fate of the ACA, especially with Xavier Becerra as the Health and Human Services Secretary and others, is going to be really important in California. Those are the 3 that stand out to me, but it's unclear to me how much of a bigger role we're going to be. I worry that some people think, oh, well, Kamala Harris will be the vice president. We'll be able to get everything done. I'm not convinced of that. But I do think that California will be an important part of the conversation and no longer seen as you know, this impediment to what the federal government wants to do. I mean, the great question for me is, what do all of those lawyers that Xavier Becerra hired at the California Department of Justice do with a Democratic administration? Because suing the federal government will become a thing of the past.
So for both of you, let me ask about wildfires and how the Biden administration might impact that. You know, it seemed like the federal support has been, we wish it could have been more in California to really help us out with that. And a lot of the lands where the fires have been happening are federal lands. That's something that you're tracking. You know, do you see any, we might have a better audience with the federal government on that, and that could be something really helpful to us. Obviously, a lot needs to be done in California to help with the wildfire situation, which is getting worse and worse and worse.
I mean, I think personally, there's sort of 2 buckets here, or maybe 3, but like one is just the relationship. I agree. I mean, I think not only is Kamala not just going to be, just a lobbyist for California, I think she's going to have to be very careful not to appear like that. But let's face it, we had a president who's been like accusing us of not raking the forest. I mean, you can't, like, when you start from that kind of like bad faith place, it's just even hard to have a decent conversation. Obviously, FEMA has come to the state's aid. There has been some conversations around forest management, but I think on a just practical level, you're going to have just a better partnership there. And then, it's clearly linked to climate change. So us rejoining Paris, us having real conversations about everything from fuel economy, to power plant emissions, to just I think, all of those things are important and going to be, a big thing. And then I think, you're going to have an administration who's not just more willing to spend money, period, because they're Democrats, but happier to spend that in California, which I do think that, I think the Trump administration walked a pretty careful line of not going too far to punish us, but it didn't seem like they were jumping up and down to kind of sit down and hash out, detailed forest management policies with California.
Yeah, I will only say, I think you're right. In addition to forest management is the ongoing discussion over climate change. That's a very large one. That's a dramatic turnaround with a President Biden versus a President Trump. And then I'm just kind of curious. I mean, the issues of like homeowner insurance and where we build and those kind of policies, which are state driven. Isn't there a federal component to some of that? And isn't there a proactive nature that a federal government could get involved? I think it's not just to California's cachet in Washington. It's the Western United States. I mean, this is not an East Coast problem, respectfully to my friends in my native North Carolina. I mean, wildfire is not a thing we think about, but this is a Western problem. And I hope there is some Western presence in this conversation to figure out how to do this, because I worry as a journalist, not as a policymaker, that it's not something that a single state can solve, even a state as big as California. There's a component that goes far beyond just the borders of California to this. So I think it's gonna be really interesting to see who the Biden administration picks in some of these other positions that could have an impact there, whether it's housing or interior or places where we can have
Department of Agriculture too, right? They oversee the
where we can have a larger conversation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So COVID-19 has ravaged California. The last count that I saw was 1.4 million Californians have been infected, and we've lost the lives of 20,000 Californians. It's also really hurt our economy. So what, on a state level, what are you tracking in California due to COVID-19? I'll start with you, Marisa. What are the most interesting pieces that you're going to be watching at KQED and in your own mind as well?
Well, I mean, honestly, I hate to turn it back to DC, but I think what happens in the next week with the stimulus talks, and then obviously what happens in Georgia and whether Biden is able to push that stuff further is, I think, kind of the biggest question at this point. I mean, we did see that, the state budget is not in as bad of shape as we had thought earlier this year, largely because of our tax structure and capital gains, and, sort of our progressive tax structure that everybody says we need to change, but then they're all happy when this happens, right? So I think there's so much within that that needs to happen for Californians and for California, right? So if we talk about unemployment insurance, about stimulus checks, that's clearly so important. I mean, I was just talking about the fact we have a family friend ourselves down in San Bernardino County who passed away last week from COVID-19, a restaurant owner, an older guy who had heart issues and diabetes. And it was the person that if we had paid to stay home might be alive today, but he did not feel like he could close his restaurant, I'm sure, because it supports so many people. And so I think that to me is what I'm watching the most. Within that, obviously, Democrats are pushing hard, and California is really hoping for not just help to individuals, but to state and local governments, which I guess I shouldn't be surprised has become so partisan, but it's kind of interesting to me. I mean, I'm sure that local governments in Kentucky are just as worried about being able to keep firefighters and police officers and teachers employed as those in California, but it has become this very partisan thing. So, I mean, that's really what I'm looking for. And then, how does the governor and the legislature handle this extra money? The LAO has essentially advised them to really spend it on one-time things because they do see that this is going to be, the downturn will come in terms of state revenues. But so I think you could say that the state, I think Democrats in the state clearly learned some lessons over the past decade and a half. We have a rainy day fund. We have, I think, a lot more caution around the types of one-time revenues and whether you don't plow those into ongoing programs, but it's still going to be hard choices. And I think that, the questions of how long this current shutdown lasts and what that means, how the vaccine, I mean, there's so many moving parts that are so related to how we move forward. And I think that that's kind of my question. I mean, it's hard, John might speak to this too, but I think one of the challenges of this year as a journalist is that so much is happening. You don't have time all the time to step back and ask those bigger enterprisey questions because you're just trying to, cover, chase your tail on the rising COVID rates and the French Laundry or whatever other BS stuff. So I haven't I do feel like there's questions that in a year we might be stepping back to ask about the way we've handled this that we haven't even had time to kind of process yet.
So if I can, John,
go ahead, please.
Let me try to find a couple of different ways to kind of look at what I'm watching. One thing that I think is, it's a procedural thing, and I know people don't want to get too lost in the process of Sacramento, but I think it's really important to note is that, starting tonight, the greater Sacramento region joins the other regions in the full shutdown of our activities, and we go through January because of the ICU capacity. Bay Area, of course, is doing some stuff voluntarily. We all think we know where we're going. I raise that because the legislature has to come back to Sacramento. They are scheduled to be back in session on January 7th. I don't know how they do that. Many of you saw that the state assembly had to meet in the arena of the NBA Kings on Monday because of public health concerns to take the oath of office. I don't know how they meet in the Capitol. I don't know what their schedule looks like. That was the single largest impediment to get anything done this year was the fact that they couldn't meet in person and the rules were complicated. They couldn't vote remotely. They couldn't do all this. That process may not matter to some people, but that process is huge in figuring out what the state's going to do to engage on these pandemic issues that have arisen. I don't know what that calendar looks like. And the legislative calendar is not super fast. As I said to the pro tem of the state Senate the other day, I told her, I tried to be kind of polite about this. I said, at best, the process of the legislature is deliberative. At worst, it's pokey. And you don't have time this year. People are not going to wait for you until March, April, and have committee hearings. And then maybe we'll pass a bill at the end of the summer. People are hurting. There are troubles. There are problems in the state. So first and foremost, it's like, how is the process of governing the state going to move forward when you have public health concerns about the actual mechanics of doing it? And then where do you spend your resources and where do you spend your focus? We all know, and this audience is, this is custom made to your audience, the workplace has been changed dramatically. And so what does that look like in terms of employers and employees? What are the rights and responsibilities? We saw a bill introduced this week that immediately talked about having more time to take off for leave for COVID-related issues, but would extend beyond that. We saw a bill that came back on the other side and said some small businesses should get tax credits to compensate for all the regulations they have to put in place for COVID. And then the thing that, and I don't just say this because I got two of them upstairs in distance learning, and one of them just came and made noise in the kitchen that I kind of glared at him at, is schools. What are we doing about the school issue? There is no statewide policy on schools and how to deal with this. The Newsom administration has chosen to basically make this a local issue. And as we have maybe politely, but kind of poking at him a little bit, made it to the governor, you've made rules for hair salons and fitness centers and other things on a statewide level, but you're not making rules for schools on a statewide level. And how does that impact everything? Because we all know that schools are foundational to your businesses, to everybody's lives, to everything. And what are we doing on the great issue there? It's not just money, but it's also an understanding of what rules are being put in place. Money is, of course, huge, but it's not the only part of it. So I'm kind of in a swirl right now. We're trying to figure out what this year is going to look like on these pandemic issues. But I know everybody knows them, and I know everybody knows what the issues are, and maybe everyone doesn't agree on how to solve them. But I think the path forward, for the very reason that we are all locked down in our houses right now, remains unclear.
So related to the pandemic a little bit, is that COVID-19 at first boosted Governor Newsom's approval rating, and with a lot of widely praised actions. But as the crisis has lingered and reemerged, it seems like it might be impacting the perceptions of the governor. There always seems to be a recall petition out there, no matter what year it is or who is the governor. But there is one out there right now that's drawn some media attention. And so I'll go to both of you. I'll start with you, John, and then go to you, Marisa, next. But is this just another silly petition that's out there, or is there something else afoot?
This is not a silly petition for a variety of reasons. But the thing that I'm struck about, I mean, I'm having flashbacks to covering, state government in 2001 and 2002, and the run up to the historic recall of 2003, and there are parallels to that era and this era. And let me just briefly start at this point. we know that Gray Davis, who maybe didn't come in with the charisma and popularity that Gavin Newsom did, but we know that Gray Davis inherited something that was not his fault at the outset, which was the energy crisis in California and the Enron craziness and all of those things. The problem for Californians became how Gray Davis managed that crisis. Fast forward to 2019, or 2020, I should say, not 2019. Everything was beautiful in 2019. Managed to fast forward to 2020, where Gavin Newsom didn't create the pandemic, but people are calling into question his management of the pandemic response from the state government. And the recession fears and the fear that elected officials are not listening. I felt until several weeks ago that this was another one of those recalls. Every governor has had a recall petition filed against them, and almost all of them, except for one, have gone nowhere. This one seems to have caught some fire. In talking to the people who are now working on it, one of the people now working on it, by the way, was the architect of the campaign of the 2003 recall, and that caught my attention. It's a well-known Republican political consultant. They expect to turn in, and they've already turned into the counties, and they expect to see almost 800,000 signatures gathered on a voluntary basis, with those reports coming official in the Secretary of State's office next month. That's half the way there to getting what they need to get this on the ballot. And they are actively now have a professional fundraiser, someone who worked for George W. Bush and who worked for Pete Wilson, raising money. This is a serious thing. And from what I have heard from people in talking close to Governor Newsom, they are taking it seriously. I don't know what to make of it beyond that, but people are angry. This is a combustible period in American politics and California politics, and nothing is impossible. And I think the governor is going to be watching this off to the side, off of his field of vision in the next few weeks, because there is an anger out there and people are looking for someone to be the person that they poke at for their anger. And the governor is in that position for a variety of reasons, some because he's the governor and some because there have been questions about some of the decisions that his administration has made.
Marisa, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I want to see the signatures. I mean, I like they say they have that. I you know, they haven't been validated. I think they've
turned them into the counties.
55,000 to the state. Yeah. Look, I think I agree with John. I've heard the same thing, that the governor's office is taking this seriously. I think after 2003, they'd be, you know, silly not to. On the other hand, PPAC has a poll out today where they find that, you know, 59% of likely voters are approving of how Newsom is handling the economy, including, you know, 85% of Democrats. So I guess there's two questions I have. I mean, obviously one is if they can get to the 1.5 million valid signatures, because you need what, more than that, because not all of them will be valid, right? Usually
that's the number you need before the drop off.
1.4 million is what they need, right?
Yeah, they need about 1.6 million. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So, you know, that is a lot, but so I think there's a question about whether they'll be able to do that. And then even if they did, I guess I'm just skeptical that they would be able to field a candidate. Maybe. I mean, if things keep going poorly, if the vaccine isn't working, if we're still in lockdown, you know, in months ahead of this, like, you know, if there was a recall today, do I think Newsom would have more to worry about? But if you look at the trajectory of how things could be going over the next year, I'm just skeptical that the Republicans would be able to field a candidate and get it together in time, you know, to beat Newsom. You know, Schwarzenegger was obviously a very unique person. And I think, you know, that there's always two questions on a recall, right? Do you want a recall? And then who do you replace them with? But those are related because the whole campaign happens at once. So I think anything's possible, but I'm not as bullish as John on this being a threat to Newsom.
Well, and I just want to really quickly make clear, I'm not suggesting that the recall necessarily would be successful. I mean, Marisa's laying out all the caveats that are super important and all the hurdles about actually removing Gavin Newsom from office. But success and qualifying are two different things. And when you qualify an initiative, a recall like this, you're simply just talking about the anger of the electorate and looking for someone to blame. So I think the possibility of the election is dramatically higher than it was 6 weeks ago. To Marisa's point, the success of an election is an entirely different conversation and would depend on a variety of factors, to her point, not the least of which is who else you want there. I mean, I think a lot of historians will look back and say, had Arnold Schwarzenegger not stepped in, that would have been a very different conversation 17 years ago.
Yeah, and I just think that as frustrated as people are right now, and I think that the governor, regardless of your party, is the natural person to take out a lot of that anger on. I'm not, like I said, I'm just not sure that that anger is going to hold, because we are in such a bizarre moment right now, and it does seem like there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think, you know, one of the things some of the consultants on that side are really banking on is like this idea that, oh, my friends who are Democrats are mad as well. And, you know, I just, seeing that number in PPIC, I mean, it's a poll, take it for, you know, as such, but I thought that was really interesting that in this moment, as, you know, we're talking about shutting down the state again, and most places are, and ICUs are filling up, and the economy is on the rocks, that you have a majority of folks still approving of his handling of it. That number surprised me. I thought that would be lower. So that to me is sort of good news for Newsom. And I think something like the French Laundry will blow over. I mean, obviously, you know, whoever Kevin Faulconer runs against Newsom in 2022, regardless, you know, if there's not a recall, we'll use that. But I think I question the potency and longevity of that story alone.
Okay, so something that has been, I'm not sure if it's a big concern in Sacramento, but has become a major concern for the Bay Area Council, for our members, and we're hearing about this from other business associations throughout the state, is the business climate in California. And California has always been tough for businesses to operate in compared to other states, but it still really has been valuable to be here, right? So you could, you know, there was a lot of pain in the neck stuff, but because of the talent and, you know, the proximity to a lot of others, you know, all sorts of different reasons, which I won't get into, it was still worth it. But with remote work and the wildfires, and then the tax proposals that didn't go through in Sacramento, but were still there. Of course, there was Prop 15, and then tax measures that passed. You know, in San Francisco, there were some, you know, really glaring ones, but there were others in local cities. The perception of value has, our members are telling us, has really evaporated, and so alarm bells are ringing as we watch. You know, this perception of staying in California. It's become uncool to be here. It's cool to come up with a strategy to leave. And, you know, it's not just perception, right? We've lost Charles Schwab, we've lost McKesson, Silicon Valley founder Hewlett Packard just announced that they're leaving. Several prominent venture capitalists are leaving, Elon Musk, you know, and many others. And so, and that's just in the past few months, most of those. So is the political class paying attention to the business climate? And, you know, or should we, you know, expect things to get better or worse? You know, what is your read of the business climate issue? And I'll start with John, just because Marisa, you were just going in, and then I'll return back to you.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't for a moment minimize those concerns. What I am just kind of struck by is that, you know, not dissimilar to when we were talking about maybe the past being prologue with the recall or other things. This is not a story that I feel like I've not heard before. I mean, there have been California versus Texas, California versus everywhere. There's been that conversation over and over and over and over. And perhaps there is something, there's a secret sauce to this one that is somewhat different. I feel as though a good portion of our conversation is also about the economy writ large, the California economy, the national economy, and the unsettled nature of the national economy at this point in terms of the workplace, the future of work, and some of these things. So I know that there are legislators who hear this in Sacramento. I don't know anybody that is blind to it. I think the question is trying to evaluate, you know, in the old, who is credited with the first person who said this? Maybe the legendary Pat Moynihan, the senator from New York. You're welcome to your own argument, not your own facts, or, you know, the plural of evident anecdotes is not evidence. I don't know what's an anecdote, and I don't know what's evidence, and I don't know how to measure those kind of trends. But I do think it's an important time for business folks to come forward and talk about that and present more than the anecdote, but look for that kind of larger evidence moment here, because I think that we get a receptive audience out of Sacramento, because people are going to be looking, I think some smart people, for a holistic, systemic conversation. And this is the time to bring that forward, but it needs to be brought forward not as the political anecdote. It can't be Elon Musk moving to Texas, because it's kind of an anecdote, and the guy, forgive me, is a little eccentric to start with. So, I mean, I'm really curious to see, can people bring a larger discussion to that? And that includes also the tax structure, without getting too far deep into this. And the long discussions we've had over figuring out a more holistic, using the word again, tax structure in the state that's not layered upon layer. So it's a really interesting time to have a conversation, John, but I still struggle with the fact that this sounds like a conversation we've had before, and people are going to be looking to see, you know, what's really bigger than just the individual points.
Yeah, that's a great point. Marisa, what do you think about this?
I mean, if I were advising your group and others, like as a consultant, I would say that if I were going to be starting these conversations with the Democratic majority in Sacramento, I would focus a lot on the connection between what's good for companies and what's good for workers. I think this is like a hard time to feel bad for Elon Musk and Tesla when you have, you know, essential workers, largely Black and brown, getting sick and dying at much higher rates, you know, a safety net that has, from a, you know, around healthcare, you know, we've seen one party spend the last 4 years trying to kind of undermine, and, you know, schools that were already underfunded and struggling before a pandemic, unable to open. So like, I think that like kind of like tying some of the concerns of the community to what it means for the real, from the business community to the broader community is going to be important, because you have people in positions of power like Lorena Gonzalez, who's very concerned about workers' rights. You have, you know, someone like Newsom, who obviously comes from a business background, but also knows who brought him to the party. And I think that like, I've just as an observer, those things shouldn't be mutually exclusive, right? I mean, there's a reason like the stock market is booming, but most people feel a strain right now. And I think that, and to John's point, these are bigger conversations. I mean, we just had Uber and Lyft win a ballot measure, you know, to saying that they should get their own labor rules, different than what most of us are subject to at our companies. And so how does that play out? How do they make sure as companies that their workers aren't on food stamps or unable to pay for healthcare if they can't work? Like, I think those are the things that I think you would get further with some of the more left-leaning, you know, Democrats. That said, we've seen in Sacramento a real, I think, interesting kind of evolution of the Democratic Party, because with the Republican Party shrinking, you almost have kind of two factions, like the moderate business-friendly Dems and the more labor progressive Dems. And I think that I think the other, like, I'll just give you guys all my free advice, but like, I think some of that too might be like figuring out who are the actual best spokespeople within that caucus of moderates, and not just leaving it to the loudest voices, but the people that might actually be effective in bridging those gaps. Because I think sometimes what we've seen is it just become, you know, as often happens in politics, regardless of where you're on the political spectrum, you know, the bomb throwers kind of get the most attention or get the most power, and then it doesn't actually get anybody anywhere. So, you know, I live in San Francisco. I mean, I will say, like, John, you and I have talked about this before, like, what do the election results in San Francisco tell me? That we are a bunch of like socialist freaking, like, you can't get lefter than this city. I mean, Joe Biden won by 85, like with 85 points, you know, to 15. I was just looking, you know, at some of the statewide measures that failed, like Prop 15, 70%, almost 71% in San Francisco. So you also have to like differentiate between here and what it might look like in Contra Costa or in LA. But, you know, I think that obviously some of what happened locally is symbolic. I mean, I know it's not totally symbolic, but I think the CEO pay measure you know, is that going to have an on the ground impact in terms of like funding, actually making a difference in funding, you know, city programs? No, the point of that was to embarrass these companies that have these huge gaps between what they're paying their median employees and their CEOs. Politically, is that the best way to do it, or practically? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's going to have the intended effect, but you know, let's be clear, this comes after years and years of conversations in the city about that widening gap and, you know, a huge homeless problem and people that are making minimum wage, if that, who can't, or multiple jobs, who can't, you know, stay in their houses. So it's not as if like, I think one side has the market cornered on where, you know, the impacts of this, they're real for workers as well as businesses.
Yeah.
Can I give you 30 seconds, John, since Marisa inspired me by free advice? Here's 30 seconds. And it's based on nothing other than my own experiences as a journalist and as a human in the state now. Sweet spot is working parents. What are the policies that work for working parents, and what do working parents need? And that crosses parents of children of different ages. So it could be childcare, it could be affordability of college and access to, you know, post-secondary education. It could be work schedules and work hours and the ability to do that. Working parents is a sweet spot that I think a lot of people should look at and could talk about, because it starts a conversation on a lot of things: wages, affordability, quality of life. I'm not excluding people who don't have children. Please don't understand that, or people who are at an older point of life where their children have grown up and moved on. And so I'm not saying those people aren't important, but working parents starts a conversation in a lot of policy areas that I think people would be smart to think more about.
Yeah, that's great. We, you know, the Bay Area Council sponsored the paid family leave bill that passed through and produced a lot of studies to help provide the fact case for that this year. So we're
I think
totally
I think we do have, for, you know, for every CEO ballot measure, we have some really good examples in San Francisco of how the business community has come to the table.
Yeah, we're at the civic table. There's no question.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I think
and the charitable contributions that people, you know, the companies make, the volunteers of the volunteers, the employees, all kinds of stuff like that. You know,
just
the
consider
residents.
that the folks in Sacramento are only like usually half as crazy as the ones at City Hall, and maybe you can just like take some of your lessons from those conversations.
So you're saying there's a chance. That's good. That's good. So let me turn to some of the, I'm going to close with a question of who's going to be our next senator or senators. So, but I'm not going to get to those now. So I want to go to some of the Q&A questions that we've got here, just as a little tease on that. So the first one is from Gary Cohn, who writes that the Newsom administration had some ambitious goals in healthcare, expanding coverage to undocumented seniors, an Office of Healthcare Affordability and Medical Reform, CalAIM, and much of that was derailed by the pandemic. What do you see happening in healthcare and legislature and the administration in 2021?
I think, short answer, I'm going to try to do this like lightning round here, because I know many questions that are out there probably. CalAIM will come back. I think it's been a delay on that. I mean, there's some debate as to whether CalAIM as a policy of changing the Medi-Cal relationship with counties and states is the right policy or not, but I think that conversation will come back. I think Medi-Cal expansion is absolutely back. We've already seen, again, based on lack of immigration status, that to come back as a full funding. But I also think that there are larger issues about Medi-Cal. That's, of course, dependent on the federal government, some too. And I do think the Newsom administration wants to try to figure out, when it gets the bandwidth, how to push the envelope of how much a state can control things. You know, it was prescription drug issues, it was other issues like that. So I think healthcare remains a key element. I think all roads, though, quite frankly, begin with the future of the Affordable Care Act, and that's a Washington conversation, and then how that plays into whatever the state of California could do.
Great. So here's a question from Angie Jin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which, oh, just went away. What's your view of the opinion of people of color turning red? So more people of color voting for Trump, let's say, in 2020. You know, how do you think that happened? Why did that happen? First of all, did that happen in California? I know that happened nationally. I'm not sure about what happened in California. I don't know if you know, but do you know? And then what do you attribute that to? You know, is lack of messaging on Biden's part, something else happening out there?
I mean, I would say first it's important to note that yes, Trump got a larger share this year than in 2016, but Biden still overwhelmingly, I mean, 80s, 90s won, you know, African-American, Latino voters. I think that this is, yes, I think Democrats do have a problem. I think they need to stop taking people of color for granted and make assumptions about, I mean, I think we all have a problem here in the media and in politics, which is like, we generally don't say like, all white people do this, right? Like, why would we think that all Latinos are a monolith? The Asian American community spans, I mean, what, hundreds of countries, languages, religions, beliefs, backgrounds. I mean, it is not, it's just, I think it's sloppy and lazy for us to kind of continue talking, especially as so many of these groups grow, to think that you know, I mean, the easiest example of a Cuban in, you know, Miami is the same as a Mexican immigrant in LA, or even a Mexican immigrant in Texas. I mean, we saw this. I think some of it's, yeah, around campaigning. I mean, quite frankly, I think broadly, Democrats did end up being hurt by the fact that they decided to not, you know, knock on doors in a lot of places and really be out there having those conversations. And I think that like, I think it's sort of like the bigger electorate question. I mean, it's the fracturing of the media environment. Where are people getting their information? I mean, look at Arizona as a counterpoint to that. The work that Democrats did in that community, most like led by Latinos who, you know, watched Joe Arpaio do the check your papers law. I mean, they flipped that state blue for the first time in decades. And so I think that like I think some of it is the nuance of the fact that different communities in different places are just always going to have different concerns. I think some of it was, you know, the socialism problem, the messaging around Black Lives Matter and defund the police. But I also just think it's the fact that any group, as they become more sophisticated politically, because you're voting more, you're more involved, you've been here longer, in the case of immigrants, they're gonna, you know, have different concerns, and they're not gonna stick to becoming the same thing. So I'm kind of both minds. I think Democrats do have some challenges to address, but I also think that some of the rhetoric around it has been a little overstated.
Thanks.
I'll give you 10 seconds. 10-second thing is I don't deny that those items are out there. Marisa's right that I think they might be in pockets more than a broad thing. I think a lot of this, though, goes back to an issue of class and an issue of income and money. And you see disaffected people at the lower end of the income scale, be they communities of color or Caucasians, who are frustrated and angry, and Trump tapped into that. Yeah. And he tapped into that very well. His over-the-top rhetoric is probably the end of what happened, plus his pandemic response. But that is still an issue that Democrats have to wrestle with. They have to figure out how they're going to make the party listen to beyond environmentalists with electric cars who make money. And that's a challenge in Sacramento as much as it is in other places too.
Let me ask, so you've touched on this a little bit in your conversation, but Prop 22, AB 5, so it went down pretty soundly. Now, there was a lot of money behind it, but it did go down pretty soundly. And there's been quite a lot of kvetching, for sure, about AB 5 from a lot of, you know, including newspaper delivery people, but, you know, all kinds of folks affected by it. So, you know, do you see, is that a sort of message received in Sacramento about that, or nope, we're going to try some other way of doing it? And what about on the federal level? So now, you know, the Biden is there, and there's a Department of Labor. You know, could there be some federal actions that might codify it in a different way? You know, John, do you have any?
I want to say something super quick on that. Yeah, because I know Marisa had touched on 22 in the opening. Like, I agree 22 won, probably in part because of a $222 million campaign, the most expensive ballot measure campaign in American history. But I would say it goes to show that a well-run campaign, or the campaign with the right message, can win. And the Prop 22 people were smart in that they started to make the campaign about workers, about drivers. When they made the campaign about drivers, I think they got out of those low poll numbers and they swayed people that they were helping drivers. And of course, the story was, to be fair, they were helping drivers. It's just that the benefits that drivers would have gotten if they were classified as employees would have been more generous in many cases than what the app companies were giving them. So I feel like that the lesson of Prop 22 is that people were worried about workers. They weren't, extolling the virtues of I love Uber and I love DoorDash. It was, we're thinking about the drivers, and that was the whole campaign. And so I think that's the question, is like, what does this say about the changing face of work and the app-based economy and the gig economy, or whatever the hell we want to call it? But I found it interesting that basically 3 days after the election, the leadership of Lyft was coming back and saying, let's cut a deal at the Capitol. You don't usually see the people who win a ballot campaign come back and say, well, let's cut a deal. It's usually the other way around. And so I think they want to continue to have that conversation. But I think the challenge here is like whether the labor union led part of the Democratic legislature sees a win, enough of a win for the working person. And I think that's the whole question, is like, what does that look like? Because it's going to be a very worker focused conversation, which means employers, business community certainly got to be involved in that. But if the Democrats in Sacramento don't see a win for workers, then that's where we're going to continue to get this clash. And I think that's why Prop 22 passed, because it became all about the drivers. It was nothing else.
Yeah. What do you think about tax increases for coming out of Sacramento? The budget numbers are better than expected so far, but we're headed for some rough times probably for the next couple of years. And we never really knew how serious those tax increase proposals were in Sacramento last year. And they didn't succeed. Will they come back stronger, or is it that we're headed into some elections that will depress the pressure to get those tax increases passed? What's your read on that in terms of from Sacramento?
Very quick, I'll let Marisa jump in.
I don't really know. Go for it.
I think there's a rhetoric versus reality thing. I think you're going to hear a lot of tax proposals because there are a lot of Democrats who are passionate, who think that we have a revenue problem in the state. We have a sustainable revenue problem in the state. The most prominent one to me is that you've got a group of Democrats who want to have $2 billion of the state general fund earmarked every year for homelessness programs. They are exactly right that we've got a not consistent funding pattern for to combat homelessness in communities across the state. But how do you get $2 billion out of the general fund? You got to raise how much comes out of the general fund. You got to have more money out of that. Problem with taxes, of course, is that it's a high threshold of a vote in both houses. They're not, when push comes to shove, there are a bunch of Democrats who are awfully uneasy about raising taxes for all the reasons that I'm sure the folks on this conversation would have that feeling as well too. I actually think that Prop 15, not that you've asked about Prop 15, but what the hell? I think that Prop 15 probably could have passed if they had run a different campaign. One, if it hadn't been during a pandemic where I still believe the political oxygen was sucked out of the room. And two, if they had spent more time talking about where the money would go and not as much time talking about fair share of evil corporations. I was really surprised how much of the conversation of Prop 15 was about making people pay and not telling you where the money would go. I think on the local level, we saw a lot of tax measures pass across California, in part because I think local voters got to see where the money would go. It's a proposition for voters, as it is anybody. You got to show me what you need and not just who you want to take it from. And so I was surprised by that in the 15 campaign. I think that's also the conversation in Sacramento, is you've got to find some balance there. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric. I don't see a tax measure passing in the short term.
Okay. Marisa, let me ask you, who's going to be the next senator from California? And let me add to that.
You mean the next two senators?
Yeah. There's another, Senator Feinstein would be up for election in 2 more years. Some people think she might retire, maybe not. What's the interplay of all of that, and who do you think will be the folks?
She's not up for 4 more years.
Yeah, she's not
4 more years. Sorry about that.
So she would be 91, I think, by then.
Right.
So I mean, the smart money is on Alex Padilla, Secretary of State, for Kamala Harris's job. John, I mean, no, I don't.
I think that's right.
It seems like everybody thinks that, which, not to have a personal opinion, but I am a little surprised that he is replacing the only Black senator, female senator, with a man. But we also have never had a Latino senator in California. So like, clearly Newsom's getting a lot of pressure. I think that within this calculation, obviously now is the fact that if he does that, he will get to replace Padilla as Secretary of State. Now Javier Becerra has been named as HHS Secretary. If he gets confirmed, he will get an Attorney General appointment. I would, and as we kind of alluded to, there's now rising, there's been bubbling questions. They are starting to bubble over, I would say, including with a New Yorker story today about Dianne Feinstein and her mental acuity and whether it's time for her to step aside. I think those of us watching it have always thought she might not serve out her full term and give Newsom the ability to appoint someone, but I think there's increasing questions over whether she'll be willing to do that, and also whether she's able to really fulfill the duties of her job at this point. So that's interesting.
So here's more speculation than fact. And, I trust the people watching this will realize that we're playing the parlor game a little bit, but it's informed speculation. Maybe we'll call it that. I've talked to enough people who don't think I'm totally crazy in saying this. I think what the governor is going to seek to do to try to solve all of these people who want something by making an announcement that rolls out everything to show that he has an eye toward diversity on more than one seat. I think he would get a lot of flack, to Marisa's point, if he just rolled out Alex Padilla as the next senator, but without addressing the other communities who think they need a voice. So I think we easily could see a Senate appointment, a Secretary of State appointment, and a California Attorney General appointment at the same time, or almost at the same time. And that I would see those other spots as showing some of the other constituencies that think that they should have a voice there. That's not going to solve, to Marisa's point, it's not going to solve the idea that you take a Black woman out of the Senate and you put a man in that job, a Latino. But I do think the governor is looking toward that diversity on the broader level. The question is the timing, and the question is who, and I got some ideas, but I'm not telling Marisa because then she'll write my story. But I think that I really do think that the governor gets that. I think he's been in a tough spot, but I think Javier Becerra going to Washington helps him because now he has another way to kind of show that he has a vision for what's going to happen. And yes, Senator Feinstein, and I just want to say this really quickly. It's a very difficult conversation here because the New Yorker piece, which some of you might have read that popped up last night, we all read it, presents some very difficult challenges about whether Senator Feinstein's up to the job. These are difficult conversations about age, about gender, about qualifications. But I will tell you that we know that Dianne Feinstein and Gavin Newsom have a very good relationship. And if she would trust anybody to fill her spot, I think she would trust Gavin Newsom. So, right, governor could have another decision to make, in the near to mid future.
I guess you could also argue that if Democrats win Georgia, Kamala Harris would not be leaving the Senate. So there would be a Black woman in the Senate.
Right.
I see what you're saying. So that was incredible. Clearly you guys are in the right positions because you do such a good job of this. So thank you for the information that you provide us on a daily basis as readers and as listeners, for all that you do. You are California treasures. And thanks for participating whenever the Bay Area Council asks you. We really, really appreciate it. And we look forward to working with you this year and many years to come. So thanks, John. Thank you, Marisa. And thanks to everybody that joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.